Hey guys, it's another episode of On the Line. We are talking a lot of defense issues, and I know right now the country is consumed by Alberta separatism. Don't worry, we're going to have a lot to say about that. But there's a lot of issues unfolding all over the world that I think we also need to be keeping our eye on. My first guest today, Philippe Lagassé, he is a defense expert here in Canada. He doesn't love the term, so let's call him at the very least an informed person on defense matters. He's a professor, and he holds the Barton Chair at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. He also writes the Debating Canadian Defense Substack. We'll drop a link for that into the show notes here. He and I are having a conversation, a little bit of a debate at times, a lot of agreement, some disagreement about what Richard Shamuka and I were talking about 2 years ago. What are the obstacles to significantly increase Canadian defense spending? We're going to get into that. A lot of it's political, some of it's practical. It's a great conversation. Later in the show, we're going to go to Israel. We're going to talk with a buddy of mine there who's a reporter who's been covering how Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terror group, has been using drones against the Israelis. You would think the Israelis would be ready for that, but they are having a hell of a time. We'll be right back. This is On the Line. This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Dominion Dynamics. Canada has never had true sovereign awareness of our north. Vast parts of our country are a blind spot. And when you can't see your own territory, you can't defend it, secure it, or respond when threats emerge. Dominion Dynamics is changing that. Dominion is building a sovereign command and control capability that lets Canada and its allies see, respond, and defend across every domain. We started in the Arctic, where extreme conditions demand technology no one else can deliver. Threats don't wait for bureaucracy. They are moving faster than our institutions. Dominion is closing that gap. Speed is now the strategic capability, and Dominion Dynamics is proving you can build capability at the speed of the threat. Defend the Dominion. Dominion Dynamics. Learn more at defendthedominion.com. All right, let's get into it. My first guest, Philippe Lagassé. He is at Carleton University. He writes and speaks on defense issues. He is the Barton Chair at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, and he writes, and we'll drop in a link for him into the show notes so you can check him out, the Debating Canadian Defense Substack. It's great. We talk about some of his recent articles here. A lot I agree with, a little bit I disagree with. We're going to get into that. Enjoy my conversation with my friend Phil. Phil, always nice to talk with you, and you've been writing a ton of interesting stuff. So I actually invited you on a couple of days ago because I wanted to talk with you about a piece you had written about spending. Will we hit our spending levels? We'll talk about that. But you also just last night, because I guess you're an eager beaver. We're recording this on Monday morning. And on Sunday night, you published a new piece. We'll get to the spending bit in a minute, but tell me, what did you argue last night? You were talking a little bit about, I guess for lack of a better term, Carney's political opportunity, like his room to maneuver. Like, how would you describe it?
Well, first off, thanks for having me, Matt. I always love being with you guys, publishing with you and on the podcast. It's always a real pleasure. So over the past few months, interesting things have been happening. And one of those interesting things was a kind of throwaway comment that the Prime Minister made at the Global Progress Action Summit in Toronto, where he just says, well, you know, we've proposed Fortress North America alongside Mexico. We've proposed this to the United States in certain sectors, and we're open to that. And I kind of go, wow, okay, that's interesting. It's that kind of contrasts with the Prime Minister's previous rhetoric of the fact that the old economic and security relationship with the United States of deep integration is kind of over, and that we're moving into a new era. Now, I'm not saying that we're not moving into a new era, and we can get into that. But what was interesting to me was we're talking about that old tight relationship being over. There's clearly something happening in terms of a Fortress North America proposal. And then this coincided with the decision by Eldridge Colby to suspend the Permanent Joint Board on Defense. And a few days later, we get information from Pentagon official to Canadian media saying we've laid down a continental defense plan. The Canadians haven't taken us up on it, and this is why, that we're getting uppity about the PJBD. Is we obviously kind of said to Canada, here's what we expect from you in terms of North American defense, and you're not acting on it. So there seems to me that there's something happening in the background around some kind of Fortress North America concept. And my basic point in the piece is to say, could the Prime Minister get away with this? And I think he can, simply because he's becomes kind of emblematic of Captain Canada over the past year and kind of elbows up at that whole stuff. And the reality is he's so popular, and I think people in the country right now are just have so much confidence in this guy that he could explain away kind of the disjuncture between what he's saying over the past year and the concept of Fortress North America.
You are not a political pundit, and I'm not going to make you one, but I was just reading this morning, part of my morning news sweep, the latest batch of opinion polling. Carney right now has political capital to burn, and I don't think we need to get any more into the politics of it than that. Like, this guy is popular. He's more popular than he was when he was elected, and his primary opposition party, I don't want to say the Conservatives are in free fall, because they aren't, but they've certainly kind of fallen back to somewhere in line with their historical band of support in the low 30s. There is currently no domestic political threat to Mark Carney. And one of the things, Phil, and again, not trying to get too political here, but like when Carney made those comments, I noticed them too. And we wrote about them here at The Line. And we were like, can we please pick a lane? Because it honestly, like, obviously I'm being a little tongue in cheek, Phil, but it kind of sounded to me a little bit like telling your spouse that the marriage is over, but you should also buy a timeshare together. Like, I'm trying to figure like, what are we doing here? Like, are we leaving the Americans and moving out, or are we trying to even deepen our ties with them? One of the things about Fortress North America is that does include continental defense. And we know the Americans want us to be spending more on the military, but there's also the industrial elements of it. Things like aluminum and steel and critical minerals, things like that, energy. And what I was wondering when Carney was talking about that was if he meant more like that, kind of like, hey, like, well, let's have like an auto sector. That was last week's On the Line episode with Flavio Volpe. When we talk about the sort of thing, the reason I get nervous about it is because, as far as I'm concerned, and I think every ally right now is having the same problem we are, deeper integration with the United States gives the United States more leverage over you if and when the president wakes up at 3 a.m. and decides to fire off a tweet.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, we've seen a lot of vacillation on Canada-U.S. relations from this government, even really since the Prime Minister was appointed. So around this time last year, you may have noticed the Minister of Foreign Affairs kind of talking about just how strong the Canada-U.S. alliance is. The Prime Minister goes down and says, yeah, we're going to be part of Golden Dome. We're going to join missile defense. We're all in, man. And you're going, wow, okay. I mean, and this is happening with this domestic conversation that's very much about investing in Canada, sovereign capabilities, and so on and so forth. I think the two could be squared. Right? They're not in any kind of full-on diametrical opposition. So to your point, I think this is being used to say, look, you want to secure supplies, you want critical minerals, we want a reduction in tariffs. So can we arrive at some kind of grand bargain here that's going to outlast this particular president? And despite kind of all the talk around, well, Trump will renege on any deal, I think the Canadians are still aware that in terms of Kuzma itself, he's respected the kind of that agreement on some fundamental level. So there is a hope, I think, to try and solidify something post-Trump that would see Canada kind of integrated. I think where the sticking point is coming is what that actually involves. So my understanding is, and this may be linked to that plan that the Pentagon presented to Canada, sometime late last year, from what I understand, the Pentagon basically said, look, you're going to defend North America with us, but it's going to be with American capability. Don't start thinking that you can bring in a whole bunch of foreign capability into the continent. It's not going to work. It's our way. And I think that's probably one of the tensions here. The government is obviously still going to want to invest in Canadian industry, still want to diversify, while still defending the continent with the United States. So Canada is in a bit of a cake and eat it too position here as well, and so is the United States, because they want us to cooperate deeply, they want us to spend a lot, but they also want to impose punishing tariffs. So it's we're stuck in a bit of an opposition.
I've been, and I swear to God, I'm going to try and move off politics after this. I've been sympathetic to the point that conservatives have been making, that elbows up is a slogan, it's not a strategy. And our economic and our defense ties with the United States are so deep, we really can't operate without them. But I'm going to tell you, and this is not going to surprise you, I'm sure you've had similar conversations. I've been speaking with Canadian officials and Canadian senior military command, and what you said a minute ago is pretty much what I'm hearing from them, that the Americans are like, congratulations on your new role as our auxiliary in the defense of North America. I don't think any Canadian prime minister, liberal or conservative, survives signing that kind of deal under pressure. Just like the domestic politics, if it comes out that we went out and spent hundreds of billions on US hardware because the Americans told us to, I think that kills any government. And I just think the more the Americans do this, the more we're going to buy French weapons. And I don't know if they're going to end up caring in the end. Like if we end up with a big air fleet and a big Navy and we're being useful with it, maybe the Americans find a way to live with that. But I just don't know if the Americans realize the domestic effect this kind of pressure is going to have on us.
Yeah, I think this is why it would have to be presented as some bargain, right, on the trade front as well. Like you need to be able to go to the Canadian public and say, look, we know this is unpalatable and you don't like this, but look, we managed to reduce the tariffs, we managed to protect core sectors of our economy. And, you know, the reality is the Chinese threat and the Russian threats aren't going anywhere. So this is something that we need to do. And again, it's interesting. If it were just buying American military equipment, I agree with you, like that probably wouldn't fly. But if it were wrapped up with a nice big bow saying, you know, we've saved, you know, our economic prosperity for a generation, I think there'd still be an enormous amount of skepticism that the United States would agree to that. But to your point about Poilievre, I wrote a piece a little while ago saying, look, I mean, fundamentally, I think both the prime minister and the leader of the opposition believe the same thing. They're just saying it differently. I think the prime minister fundamentally agrees with Poilievre. I think there is a realization, look, we aren't going anywhere. We're not moving. We're not getting out of North America. We are stuck with this relationship. It's just the reality. And I can also tell you that, and you've probably heard the same things within D&D CAF, that a lot of people there, and same in the intelligence community, are like, we can't make decisions when we're angry. This president's going to go, and we're going to keep going down this road. And to be honest, I think there is kind of a realization that leaving that relationship is going to be far harder, and we have to try and leverage that security angle to salvage the economic one on some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think as one senior military officer told me, very senior, they told me the fundamental problem is that, like, we cannot not defend Canada despite the Americans. So if the American demands fundamentally are, you got to do a better job patrolling your airspace, you need a bigger fleet to keep an eye on your coast, you need more deployable land capability within your own country, what are we going to do? Zero all those things out despite them? And to a certain extent, with the things we're going to do for our own reasons are going to end up aligning with what the Americans want us to do. And I think we're kind of trying to find a way to do it that's politically palatable. Let's talk about the money, because that was the piece you had written that actually I wanted to bring you on here. 2 weeks ago, right here on the line, Richard Shamuka was here from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he and I were having a conversation about military capabilities for Canada. And the theme of it was, how much military can we afford? Because we're talking about all this money we want to spend, and something that you and I both know, the Canadian forces claim to have a lot of capabilities that only kind of exist on paper because we don't have the personnel or the equipment's in bad shape. There's also a ton of modern capabilities that we just don't have. And what Richard and I were talking about is, like, I don't know if the general public understands how much money you can spend on the military just to kind of get it back to the baseline of where it should be. And I use the comparison of, if you don't take care of your house, it can get to the point where it might almost be cheaper to build a new house. Like, we've 24 Sussex Drive to the Canadian Armed Forces, where it's in such bad shape. I don't know how we're going to fix it. You wrote a piece talking about spending levels. I want to not debate you, but I want to question some of your assumptions. But first, I will give you the floor. What was your argument? Because I did think like you rooted it in history, and I think you were correct on the history of it. So what were you arguing about defense spending in Canada?
So I was basically going at the notion that I feel, based on historical trends and patterns, that even if Canada reaches 3.5% of GDP on defense for like a year or whatnot, is it going to be sustained? Are we actually going to spend those levels over the long term? And what I argued is my sense is, and we can get into why, that we're probably more likely to hover around 2.5% of GDP for the foreseeable future. And the basic argument was, look, I mean, historically, when a crisis has passed, Canadian defense spending kind of starts to retract. It goes, so after the First World War, we immediately slash. After the Second World War, we immediately slash. After Korea, we start paring down. As soon as the Cold War is over, again, we cut. Compounding that is when we look at the record in the early 90s and we look at the record in the late 2000s, so during the debt and deficit crisis under Chrétien, and then after the great financial crisis of 2008 under Harper, defense takes a major hit, right? So when you're trying to deal with your debt and your deficit, where else are you going to go in the federal budget to deal with that? And defense is going to be the thing. The last thing I found is, I mean, Kevin Page has been saying this, and it kind of dovetails a little bit with what the United States has been saying, and PJ or the C.D. Howe Institute as well has kind of published on this, and others saying, what's the plan to spend $150 billion a year? Like, how are you going to do that? Are you planning on just running ever deeper deficits? Already our debt to GDP ratio ain't looking that great when you add in the provinces, and they're the ones that are primarily saddled with the social programs. Are you going to raise taxes? Prime Minister cut taxes recently, he didn't increase them. And the alternative, are you going to cut into social programs? And there, I'm not sure the Canadian appetite is there. So I ended the piece by saying, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, there's other things happening, a variety of reasons why we may be in a new world now, and maybe we will reach 150 billion. We're living in a crisis or a series of intersecting crises that may not lead to a peace dividend. So that could be part of the reason why it's going to be sustained. Maybe, you know, that defense spending really does spur economic growth, and it really does spur productivity, and we take control of our IP. I will note, however, that economic growth doesn't really get you out of the problem, because as your economy grows, your percentage of GDP just increases that you have to spend on the military. So it's not like there's a set amount. It's not like it's 150 billion and then you're fine. Is if your economy grows, that 150 billion is going to grow along with it. So you still have the same problem. And maybe Canadians really have seen a major shift in their attitudes. I'm just not sure of that yet.
You said a minute ago, Phil, maybe you're wrong. You're not wrong on the history. Like, you're definitely like, and I know the history. You're right. We go to war, we kick ass, we come home, we just send everybody home and go tell them to open a shop. Like, it's been what we've always done. There's this story. It was like a joke I heard, not a joke. It was like an anecdote I heard years ago. He's probably passed away now, but it was a guy who'd been a sergeant in the Canadian Army in Korea, who talked about the experience of basically the Korean War starts, the call goes out for volunteers. He'd been a corporal in the Second World War. He steps forward, he re-ups. They make him a sergeant, and they tell him to take a bunch of recruits and go to the warehouse and start getting all the rifles out of storage. And he's realizing when he's doing it that these Enfield rifles are in the same boxes that he as a corporal supervised putting them into the boxes 5 years before. And they just sat on a shelf in a warehouse for 5 years and have been ignored. So you're definitely right on the history. What I do wonder about, and you have, I know you're not a columnist, but you have a columnist flair for foreseeing the comebacks to your own arguments here. You've always been writing long enough now. Because what I honestly wonder is, what if we live in an era where there is no obvious peace dividend moment? Like, what if like the threats become distributed enough that there is no signing ceremony on the battleship, and we don't salute and then have lunch? We just live in an era of sort of low to medium level crises. And I also wonder, and we don't know, I'm just posing this as a possibility. I think the rupture in Canada-US relations is pretty significant. And I think people are going to remember this. I think trust has been lost. Trust can be earned, but it takes generations. So if we stay scared for a generation, is that enough? Like, will we learn new habits? I honestly don't know, because I think I'm cynical in the same way you are. I know what the history is, but I do honestly wonder if a combination of having the poop scared out of us combined with, I think most of us think the geopolitical environment globally is deteriorating. Is it time for us to get off our butts and actually do something? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, but what's interesting, right? Let's go back to this U.S. pressure. I think part of what's happening here is the U.S. is saying, we want you to stop trying to run around and do everything all over the world. We need you to actually like take care of some problems here in North America. Like if we tell you for years, can you just do something about the Arctic? Right? Because most people don't know this. We actually have more icebreaking capability than they do, right? And we are investing quite significantly in that capability on the Coast Guard side. But they're probably saying, look, you should be doing a lot more in the Arctic. We want you to take care of this because we have other things. Similarly, they've been putting pressure on us for years to deal with Haiti. And we're like, nah, we don't want to do that, for a variety of reasons. And I was just in Australia doing some research. And what's interesting about the Australian case is they're clear. We are focused on our region. Like, we'll occasionally go overseas with the United States, as we did in Afghanistan and Vietnam and Iraq. Like, we'll do that on occasion. But, like, for the most part, we are regionally focused and we have kind of our area. And this is why we excel to some extent, because we know what our zone is. Whereas Canada is, again, in a situation where it wants to kind of be everywhere and do everything. And I think that's going to be the interesting dilemma here. So on the one hand, we are spending about $280 billion announced in 2017 to recapitalize the force that we had. 75% of that, as the Prime Minister said, is coming from the US. So already most of the stuff that we're contracting and most of the stuff that's going to come online in the next 5 years that we're going to hear about is largely American equipment. Now, that has to be sustained. Like year after year, you keep getting announcements of new American capability coming online. And then we're then going to pivot to a Canadian spend. And I suspect, though, that Canadian spend is going to be a bit harder to do than people are realizing now. And the other piece to this that I would add, where my cynicism kind of kicks in a little bit, is if this happens under a new US president who wants to make friends again, and as well, we start getting controversy and scandal around where some of this money for Canadian industry is going, you start to see, the support might wane a little bit. So I'm not saying it won't. There isn't the possibility that we'll get there, but there might be enormous pressure on us to stop trying to be everywhere and do everything, be more focused. And if that Canadian spend, if those Canadian capabilities don't come together as perfectly as one might like, you could easily see potentially a future conservative government in particular say, like, should we be spending this? Like, is this a good use of money? So I'm unclear on the future here.
I gotta make one quick disclosure here before I bring up this next topic. I was reading in the Ottawa Citizen last week about a new poll about Canadians supporting defense spending going to domestic industries by like a 4 out of 5, like a huge margin. I didn't notice until later that the poll was done by Polera, which is a reputable polling company. I didn't notice until later that it was commissioned by one of our sponsors. So I just want the listeners and the viewers to know that this is not pay for play. Like, I was just reading when I noticed it. But one of the things I did see, Phil, when I was reading this was this sky-high level of political support in Canada, of public support in Canada, to spend the money on Canadian defense companies. Two immediate concerns jumped out at me. We do actually, to an extent, I don't think the public knows, we do have a thriving defense industry in this country, but it's not that big. It should be bigger. I think it's going to get bigger. But right now, a lot of the capabilities we're going to need, particularly on high-end heavy equipment, we have to buy foreign. And it's it's an issue of kind of America or the French or the Swedes, like there are the Koreans. There aren't that many other options. That might change, but it hasn't yet. And the other issue is the one you just identified here. I have been doing my job long enough to know that it is inevitable that we are eventually going to find out that some $100 million contract went to the brother-in-law of a cabinet minister in some high-value Quebec or Ontario riding. I have seen this story 30 or 40 times before, and I would like to think the opposition parties would respond by going, well, that's corrupt and we should probably fix that. What I worry they're going to do is they're going to attack the entire defense spending program, because I've seen it happen before. Like, did we ever get around to replacing the helicopters? I think kind of. We're partially replacing the helicopters we canceled in the early 1990s. Like, this is what we do in this country. We blow up generational procurement and investments because of political opportunism. You were just down in Australia. The Aussies are way better at this than we are. Can we just import a bunch of Australian bureaucrats and politicians to run this for us?
Well, they just have such a different attitude. And look, I mean, when you're down there, everybody has their own concerns, right? I mean, there's quiet doubt emerging around AUKUS. Is this going to happen? You know, they're not exactly perfect, right? So we shouldn't engage in too many rose-colored glasses here. But fundamentally, what they do is when something isn't going right, they pivot, right? So they will say, okay, that French submarine that we were going to buy, now we're going to get rid of that on a dime, and we're going to move to AUKUS. Those Type 26s that we were building, that's not working. We're going to pivot and we're going to go buy something else. So they're faster at making these decisions than we are. We tend to kind of stick to our programs. Where I do think, though, that there is kind of not necessarily a risk, but a recognition that there may be limitations to what Canadians are willing to put up with here. So that poll that you mentioned said, ask Canadians, are you willing to sacrifice to spend a lot more on defense? But you need to ask the question a bit more precisely, right? You need to say, okay, would you accept a 2% hike in the GST? Would you accept cuts to healthcare or education transfers to provinces? Would you do that? Would you allow the provinces to tax more to cover that? Would you support ever deepening debt to do this? So asking people, are you willing to sacrifice in the abstract is interesting, but that doesn't necessarily get you at the real trade-offs. And what I've been pointing out or trying to kind of reiterate to a number of people in the defense community who I think are getting a little feverish around this is in 2015, it was all about climate change. And if you ask Canadians, are you willing to sacrifice? They're like, hell yeah, I expect my political parties to have a plan. I'll pay a carbon tax. I'll do this. I'll do that. Yeah, 100%. And then as soon as the cost of living just became really hard and really bad, right, we've kind of abandoned some of the signature pieces of that Trudeau agenda under Prime Minister Carney. So an issue that was number one and people were willing to sacrifice for and were 100% committed to, at least rhetorically, when conditions changed, suddenly their attitudes were very different. There's always that possibility. And the other thing I'll say just very quickly is how many times have we kind of seen this thing about, oh, the world is totally different now and everything's going to change. Matt, you've been here. I mean, after 2001, terrorism was going to be the thing that was going to be the issue of our lives. Extremist groups, it's not near the top of the agenda anymore. I'm not saying it's disappeared, but it's not the number one thing. After 2008, we were told the world is totally different now. We're going to have a new bargain with people. And we went right back to shareholder capitalism on steroids just now with AI. During COVID, right, we were told the world is never going to be the same. Right? We're going to change. Yeah. We're going to do it differently. And now, as soon as COVID was over, it's like, well, we never want to think about that again, particularly in this country. No inquiry. We're not going to figure out what we did. Yeah. And we're going to slash global health spending. Right. So again, I don't want to be too cynical about this. It's just, man, like it does feel like a Charlie Brown football sometimes. Right.
Oh, I remember living in the post 9/11 era. That's literally the term we had for it. It was a new era of history, and it dragged on by Canadian standards for a long time. And then it ended. And then you're right. Then it was climate change, and then it was COVID. There was a poll that came out. I've quoted it a bunch of times. I don't remember the exact details, but there was something that was absolutely hilarious. I think it was an Ipsos poll about 10 years ago that asked Canadians, like, rank their issues. And as always, like healthcare, housing, things like that. Like kind of the usual issues were very high. But like climate change was really, really high on the list. And this was early in the Trudeau majority. And then they also asked, like, how much money are you willing to spend to defeat climate change? Like $0, $50, $100 a year, and so on and so on. And basically what you ended up with was that like a supermajority of Canadians agreed that climate change was an existential threat to life on Earth as we know it. And we were prepared to spend no more than like $150 a year to stop it. And I thought putting those numbers side by side was interesting, right? And I don't know if that's a universal human constant or maybe it's a bit of Canadian luxury, but yeah, we as a people identified an existential threat to human life as we know it, and then said, but don't you dare charge me more than $200 a year to do anything about it.
Okay. Look, I mean, the listeners to the Line podcast will be aware of Mr. Gurney's observation about a year ago that are we going to see some actual action on like interprovincial trade barriers and things like that? Are we actually going to see things happening? And everybody was like, yeah, 100%. And we're serious about this time. At my university, I'm still required to buy Ontario First. If I want a copy editor, I got to hire an Ontarian under Ontario policy. I can't go to Nova Scotia. Right? And so like some things do shift, right? And I do think we will reach 2%, 2.5, and we're probably going to sustain that simply because of the sheer cost of the maintenance of the capabilities that we're currently buying. But I really need to see some polling that demonstrates to me that the Canadian public is going to be willing to spend $150 billion a year. And the other thing I'll note about this polling that's interesting, who's supporting? Old Liberal supporters, like boomers, are like the most supportive of this. So not the people who have pensions, the people who have houses, the people whose cost of living, relatively speaking, is not that, precarious. When you compare it, who's supporting the Conservatives right now with their balanced budget and cut spending? Younger people. That's telling you something about the support base for this, right? There again, it's easy to support this when it has no material impact on your bottom line. It's a different story when suddenly it becomes, are you willing to sacrifice? And yeah, as others have noted, like the amount of sacrifice that we've demanded of younger Canadians is pretty massive over the years.
Drafting them all into the military and putting them in barracks would at least help with the housing problems.
That's true. Military housing for all. Yeah.
I wish I had better ideas, but I bring what I got. So I think one of the things, and I don't know if this is good news or bad news. If anything, I would probably default a little bit more to it being bad news. We only got a few minutes left too. I can't burn your whole morning here, but I was looking at video just a few days ago, and our next segment in this podcast, after you and I wrap it up, our next segment is going to be me speaking with an Israeli journalist who's a defense, part of his beat is covering defense. And the Israelis are being swarmed by drones that you would have expected the Israelis would have the ability to cover, and they don't. And like, there's just been this obvious capability gap in the IDF, which is shocking because we think that they're better at this stuff than we are. And now they are scrambling to figure it out. What I do wonder, and I'm trying not to sound optimistic about this because I preferred it more the old way, but I just wonder if the globalization of threats is going to force Canadians to have a different attitude. And I'm not betting the farm on it, because I thought 60,000 dead Canucks during a plague might make us change our healthcare policies, and it didn't. So maybe this won't either. But I'm honestly just wondering if we are if the boot of reality is finally finding its way to the bottoms of 40 million Canadians. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, but I think what's interesting to me is if we accept that that's largely where the direction of travel is for military confrontations, I think 2 points. First, the large platforms aren't going anywhere. We're still going to be using them. They're going to work in conjunction with these capabilities. They're not going to disappear. I mean, for all the talk that the Ukraine war has shown us that it's all about drones, there's a reason that the Ukrainians still want fighter aircraft, right? Similarly, the Strait of Hormuz, like you're still going to have to escort ships trying to navigate that strait with traditional platforms. So that cost pressure is still going to be there. It's not going to disappear entirely. But what may change, though, is just how much we see the threat as one based on traditional military platforms as being the primary kind of means of dealing with threat. It may be that we put a lot more emphasis on consumables and other types of capabilities that are more sustainable over the long term in terms of cost, and similarly, that require fewer personnel. So we may be in an odd situation where you can get a certain amount of security for North America at a relatively lower cost. And if that's coupled with real skepticism that keeps mounting around interventions overseas. I mean, at some point, now we're on our third Gulf War, as you called it. Maybe we're going to get fed up with this. Maybe we're going to start wondering if this is worth it. And again, coming back to my Australia trip, I mean, the number of people who are really wondering, would Australia go to war if Taiwan were attacked? Skepticism there. Would Canada? Well, by the time we got there, so this can change in a lot of different ways. And, the old adage that we're always fighting the last war, I think this is true here as well, that we're gleaning lessons based on what we think things are going to be happening or how they're going to develop. But the world has a tendency to surprise us quite a bit.
Well, look, your military history, and we can wrap it at this, but one of the common themes of military history is that a weapons system or a doctrine or a tactic, whatever, becomes standardized. Everybody races to do it. It becomes a matter of national prestige to have it. What you don't have knights riding horses in armor? Like, what kind of loser kingdom are you? And then someone comes along and invents like a big boomstick that blasts rocks out metal tubes, and all of a sudden those knights in shining armor are obsolete. The First World War, all these battalions of infantry marching forward in rank and file didn't do well when they hit their first machine gun nest protected by barbed wire, right? So, yeah, it takes us a while to learn these things. And I think your point is bang on about the drones. The Ukrainians used the drones to neutralize Russian advantages, and then they rush in with infantry and armored vehicles, and they grab their villages back. They're still using the old weapons.
So just on your point of the First World War, right? The French built the Maginot Line based on their experience of the Western Front. And everybody was like, man, this is fantastic. Defense in depth. Like, we're going to be able to deal with like another kind of like protracted conflict. We're not going to pay attention to what's going on the Eastern Front. Right, we don't need to worry about this combined arms stuff. Right? Yeah. And then, well, guess what? Right, it's you're dealing with a slightly different conflict that you expected. Are we better at it this time? Yeah, we're better. But again, we got to be careful assuming that everything is going to kind of mimic what's currently happening. In the same way, again, that, like, could you imagine 20 years ago, it was all going to be about counterinsurgency. We were kind of like dusting off our eat spoon with a knife stuff, and that was the future of warfare. I mean, you and I have been around this long enough to know that, man, it seems like every 10 to 15 years, something is like the new thing, right? And some of the fundamentals don't change, though.
I'll let you go after this, but I have now lived long enough and covered this long enough to have seen Cold War thinking being the apex of military theory, Cold War thinking being completely discredited and used as a slur against the people who are stuck in the past. And then, oh my God, we need tanks and destroyers again.
Yep, great power conflict is back after we were told it was all counterinsurgency. Okay.
Can I sneak in one more brief question with you here? You got time?
Yeah.
I'll throw one more quick one at you here. You and I are cynical enough to know that there eventually is going to be a spending scandal in Canadian defense procurement. We know that. What I also wonder, in a weird way, Canadian politicians have always liked to spend this money at home. This is why Canadian forces often end up with equipment they don't even want. Like, they're like, no, we want the American thing. And they're like, yeah, but like, we're going to spend it here because we can't go and sign a multi-billion-dollar contract and then not give it to our own people. A lot of Canadian politicians in both parties have long viewed defense spending really as regional economic development. And that's one of the reasons we're not so good at procurement, right? Like, I've joked with Jen about this. Military procurement in Canada has a bad reputation. It actually works amazing if you realize its primary job is not to procure equipment for the military, it's to write big checks and give them to Canadians. If this becomes more politically acceptable Will we get better at it? Like, is one of our problems been that we kind of have to not be honest about what we're doing? Like, if we actually come out and we go, we need to have a domestic Canadian defense industry because we can't rely on our partners. It's something like a drone, right? It's we these things we'll be spending these things like rifle bullets. It's not going to be like buy a fleet of tanks, use it for 40 years. We're going to buy 50,000 this year. We're going to buy 50,000 more next year. Will we actually start to have some of the economies of scale that we've never really had, which is why every time we need a new fleet of naval vessels, we first need to spend billions of dollars building shipyards, which then we shut down as soon as we're done building the fleet. I don't know. Optimism and hope does not come naturally to me, so I'm not good at this. I don't know if I'm articulating this well, but if we actually decide to go out and have a defense industry, will we do better at it now than we traditionally have done? Maybe.
Maybe, but we do need to change other attitudes. So, who's done this successfully amongst our allies? Like really successfully? The Germans to some extent, the French quite a bit, the Swedes, another example, the South Koreans, right?
Yep.
These are all countries more or less of our size that have vibrant defense industrial bases. How do they do it? In each case that I've cited, they export quite a bit. So the French will go out and sell to a lot of different regimes, the Indians, the Gulf states, you name it, African states, whatever. So their commitment to kind of selling to unsavory regimes allows them to keep that domestic defense industry afloat. When I do my work there on a related project, I'll ask them, like, how do you pull this off? So when the minute that they start conceiving of a capability for the French armed forces, they're already through their DGA, so their procurement agency, thinking about what's the export potential of this? Who are we going to sell it to? Because we cannot maintain an autarkic French military capability in the absence of a vibrant export market. Koreans exporting like mad. Germans, quite a bit. Swedes also. I mean, there's a reason that they're trying to, build stuff here. You need to export if you're going to pull this off. When I look at the defense industrial strategy, we're not fully there, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the commentary is still, well, we'll sell to allies, but like we don't want to sacrifice our values too much. And this is the problem. Like even at $150 billion a year, like you're not going to be buying at the scale to sustain like a massive defense industrial base. There's a reason why our defense industrial base as it exists largely is plugged into the American system. And there's a reason why we've set up our procurement system up until recently, where what you do is you buy overseas and then you force the competitors to do most of the sustainment and maintenance here. And that's where you make the big money, right? Because that's where most of the money is. Now you're trying a slightly different model. You're saying not only are we going to do the maintenance and the sustainment here, but we're actually going to build and buy on a regular basis. So we'll see if that happens, right? But that's I'm still wondering, like, how are we different than the French? How are we different than the South Koreans? How are we different than the Swedes? What is it that we have that's different that's going to allow us to maintain a vibrant industrial base without a massive export market? The only ally I can think of who maybe gets away with this are the Japanese. But they will spend oodles of money, right? But it's still only 1% of GDP because they have a whole totally different corporate culture, right? Where they're going to just buy Japanese and build in Japan for the sake of it. Totally different mentality though from us. So I don't know. And so the last thing I'll point to is how do the French keep like the Rafales going? When they can't sell them and they don't need them, they will pay Dassault to like build 2 a year. They'll just keep it going, right? Keep that production line going. And they can do it because they have a national culture that, no, like strategic autonomy is critical to us. And I'm going to ask you seriously, Matt, can you imagine a Canadian defense minister or industry minister coming before a microphone and saying, you know what, we're just going to pay X firm to build 2 aircraft just to keep, this is the land of scandal over $16 orange juice in London. Like maybe our culture is fundamentally changed, maybe, but I would be cautious.
I'll answer the question, then I'll wrap it up. I know exactly what you mean. I can almost get to imagining a Canadian minister being willing to propose that. I have a much harder time imagining the opposition not going out and crucifying that minister. And until and unless we can get sort of a not even necessarily a pan-partisan, because look, we don't need Elizabeth May's permission. But if we can get the Liberals and the Conservatives on board going, yeah, you know what, we're going to have to do things differently, then it might be politically possible. But that would require some kind of almost grand bargain between Conservatives and Liberals that we are prepared to agree on the long-term strategic value of a production line that only makes 2 Canadian-built Gripen fighters every year.
Yeah, so the last comment, just riffing on that, we will know that we are heading in a different direction when the Conservative Party embraces industrial policy and lets go of its kind of free market fundamentals and its commitment to balanced budgets and reducing the debt. If the Conservative Party fully abandons that mentality, then we may be seeing a real sea change. Until such time as that happens, we will eventually have a Conservative government. They will come in, and if they are pursuing the policies of Mr. Poilievre, like the balanced budgets and free market economics are going to kick in. Like the support for, industrial policy may not be there, but that may change. We'll see.
Final word. You know how we solve this problem? Let's put it all in Alberta.
That's right.
Nothing but munitions assembly lines as far as the eye can see. That will help us start to fight some of these problems. Phil, thank you as always. Keep up the great writing. We'll drop a link in the show notes to where people can go and check it out. Always great to talk to you. Welcome back from Australia, and I appreciate your time today. Thanks for this.
Thanks, Matt.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by Electro Federation Canada. Canada's clean electricity grid gives us a competitive edge in attracting global investment. But to maintain that advantage, our system needs to break down barriers and unlock the grid. Aging infrastructure, supply chain constraints, and outdated regulations threaten our ability to expand and modernize the grid, essential components of meeting future capacity needs. Electro Federation Canada has developed a research-backed roadmap for grid readiness, focused on smart policy and regulatory alignment. To learn more, visit maketheswitch.electrofed.com. That was my conversation with Philippe Lagassé, Carleton University professor, writer, commentator, and analyst on defense issues, and one of our go-tos here at The Line. Coming up in a couple of moments, we're going to continue talking about defense issues. My next guest is Lazar Berman, a reporter for the Times of Israel. He has a pretty complicated beat there. He wears a lot of hats, and we'll talk with him about one of them, defense. Hezbollah is using sophisticated drones against the Israelis in northern Israel and southern Lebanon, where there's been a lot of fighting between the two. Israel has gone into southern Lebanon to take on Hezbollah. Israel has one of the most sophisticated and responsive militaries in the entire world. And Hezbollah is kicking butt at times. They're not winning the war, but they are hurting the Israelis using drones that the Israelis are not ready for. That is my next conversation with Lazar Berman, Times of Israel. This is On the Line. Well, it's always a pleasure to speak with Lazar Berman of the Times of Israel. I was just teasing him before we started that every time we talk, he's covering more topics. But when I began talking to him, it was years ago. He was a diplomatic correspondent for the Times of Israel, which in recent years has been an interesting portfolio, I'm sure. There's been a lot that's been covered by that. Lazar, you wrote recently a really fascinating story about what Israel is experiencing on the northern front. It's been fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. And look, talking about the Middle East is complicated, to state the obvious. Like, I don't think we need to do a complete recap of the entire history of like what's happened in Lebanon. But you were writing about a very specific angle here. The IDF is fighting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah is fighting back. What are they fighting back with? Because that for the IDF has made a pretty big change.
Yeah, absolutely. So Israel's been fighting Hezbollah since the 1980s. Iran established the organization amongst the Shiite community while Israel was holding a security barrier or security zone in southern Lebanon. It would stay there till 2000. And from the enemy being the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which Israel successfully kicked out to Tunis, their enemy became this Shiite organization, Hezbollah. Of course, famously, they bombed the French barracks and killed also over 200 American Marines. But their main enemy over the time was Israel. And Hezbollah proved to be a very adaptive and intelligent organization. And they're developed kind of an arms race that Israel, obviously quite adaptive as well, but does have some limits because it's so much larger as an organization, found itself being taken by surprise occasionally. So one of the big things that Hezbollah developed in the 80s and 90s was, of course, their rocket capabilities. And they understood that Israel is so eager to avoid rockets on Kiryat Shmona and other northern cities that this was a way to impose new rules of the game and limit Israeli operations. Israel pulled out in 2000. In 2006, there was the return in the very inconclusive, I would say, Second Lebanon War in 2006. And Hezbollah used anti-tank missiles very effectively then. I wouldn't say it was a strategic surprise in any way, but it wasn't like Israel really had a ready-made answer for it. And to make up for that gap, Israel developed the trophy system, which is that active defense system on its tanks and APCs and like, which has been very successful. For most of the war since October 7th, 2023, which Hezbollah joined on October 8th, so Hezbollah decided to get involved. A lot of what they were doing was indeed drones. There's a lot of anti-tank missiles, a lot of rocket fire, but drones which were kind of similar to the Iranian Shahed drones, which flew over distances, had a pre-programmed target, were slow, were usually shot down pretty easily, but once in a while they would get through. So there was an incident on the Golani training base where it hit the dining hall and killed 4 people. Israel basically won that war quite convincingly, and Hezbollah had to accept a pretty humiliating ceasefire in November 2024. And Israel basically thought that the fight had been beaten out of it, and they were pretty surprised how determined Hezbollah was to join this Iran war because they stayed out of the 2025 one. Something that has developed really in recent weeks, it's not the first time Hezbollah did this, but this is clearly their successful effort that they're doubling down on, is these first-person view attack drones. And you're seeing them be used multiple times a day, striking, sometimes even dozens of times a day, striking not only Israeli communications and cameras and things like that, like they were earlier, but indeed going after Israeli troops. So since the ceasefire that Trump imposed on Israel in April, we've had 4 IDF soldiers killed, another civilian killed who was working for the defense ministry, and dozens injured. And what I was writing about in that piece and what frustrates me is that for people like you and me who pay attention to this stuff, and obviously for the IDF is paying attention to what's going on around the world, it was pretty obvious that this was a ready-made solution for Hezbollah, right? Because obviously Hezbollah can't develop an air force or anything like that. It can't stop Israel from doing what it wants in the air. But if groups like ISIS in Mosul and Syrian rebels are able to use drones to attack the Russian air base in Syria, and then you saw what the Azerbaijanis were able to do against Armenia, it was pretty clear that there is a new tactical age or at least development upon us. And then when you look at what's been going on in in Ukraine, between the Russians and Ukrainians, it's turned into a drone war, hasn't it? Where there's this 10, 15 kilometer wide zone where soldiers, you can't walk around in. Both sides are producing tens of thousands of drones, producing millions of drones a year. And the FPV drones are really, a central part of that effort. It's cheap. It's not complex technology. You can make it in a place that is pretty hard to discover. You can make it in garages. You can order it from China. It was clear that that was the ready-made solution for Hezbollah. So the fact that Israel has not come to this war with a response that is with one response, there's all sorts of responses, but with one response that is effective and widely spread throughout the forces in Lebanon, I think that is pretty unforgivable. And right now what you're seeing is Israel is running after and putting a lot of effort into trying to find a solution to get to the troops quickly.
Obviously, Lazar, you have been paying attention because I've been paying attention too, and you're rattling off all of the things I was looking at. For me, it was about a year ago. I was at a defense industry conference in Ottawa. And one of the things I realized was that, yeah, you had a lot of armored vehicles, you had rifles, pistols, you had mock-ups of missiles or large platforms like aircraft or ships. But a pretty huge amount of the floor space at that convention center was taken up by drones or drone-enabling technologies, optics and computer systems, control systems, things like that. And I began looking around and thinking, the next war ain't going to look like the last one. And, at the very start of my career, I was covering the Canadian mission in Afghanistan. And I started to realize that if we were to try and pull something like that off again, the Taliban would have an air force. They would be able to swarm our bases, swarm our forward operating bases, go after our supply convoys, and they would do it at distance. Like they would actually have long range fires. And I remember, like in Afghanistan, one of the things the Canadians took for granted is that we had the artillery. And if anyone was causing problems, we'd call it into one of our fire bases. And, we had huge 155 millimeter artillery, and we'd rain fire down on these guys at a distance. With first person drones, especially some of these ones that have fiber optics, so you can't even jam them. They got these tiny little cables that you control them remotely. They'd be hitting us from 20 kilometers away, and you wouldn't always know if they were coming. And I wrote an article about a year ago where I specifically sounded the warning of this is going to change everything because these things are cheap, they're easy, they're disposable, and all of the Western militaries, our assumption has always been we'd be shooting at enemy helicopters or aircrafts or trying to shoot down incoming missiles. So we've spent billions of dollars on systems that fire $1 million missiles. You're going to shoot $1 million missile to take out a $1,500 drone? Is this going to be the way? This is pure asymmetrical warfare. And when I wrote this column about a year ago, I remember saying, I don't think any Western country is ready for this, with the possible exception of Israel. And then over the last couple of weeks, even before you had written your piece, I was looking at some footage. You've probably seen the video. It was in Lebanon. There had been some Israeli troops that were injured and they needed to be evacuated, a medical evacuation by helicopter. And Hezbollah came after the helicopter with drones. And they missed, but I remember thinking to myself, yikes, these guys had no defense. And if they'd gotten one of those drones into the rotors of that chopper, you lose the chopper and you lose the wounded soldiers that were in it. Did the IDF think it was ready? I'm just kind of trying to understand what the expectations were here. Was the IDF not as ready as they thought they were, or did Hezbollah's capabilities kind of leapfrog a bit? Did they make a sudden advance?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. One, there's the psychological element that you were somewhat alluding to, that since the 1980s, when Israel was fighting Syria, 82, when Israel was fighting Syria in Lebanon, since then, Israeli soldiers have known that anything flying above head, if you hear any noise, whether it's an engine or a rotor or anything like that, it's yours. So you didn't have to worry about looking up anymore. And for that reason, Israel, which had developed tactical air defenses that move with the ground forces. A lot of it came from the United States. They started shutting down those units because everything above head is friendly. And of course, their air defenses became things like Iron Dome because that's what they were facing. Very successful. Again, came a little bit late, but very quickly became the world leader in that type of defense. So that was just kind of the psychological assumption. There was also, I think, the idea that the Hezbollah drones that had been fired and other, the Houthis as well, through electronic warfare and things like that, it's not a problem that really needs a new focus or even creating new types of units to deal with it. There's really a problem when you see that new units are being created because the current structure doesn't allow you to do it. So I think that was very much there as well. And I think the idea was that they're so beaten down that they're just kind of hanging on and they're not going to make any sort of tactical or technological leap that Israel needs to worry about. Now, it's true. If Israel was maneuvering, aggressively in southern Lebanon, I think it would actually be much less of a problem, because right now these drone operators can, they don't have to be, they can be alone, they could be in a house, and they know that if they're north of the Litani, they're basically immune from Israeli attacks. Now, I think now, because it's become such a problem, that Israel, if they find the operators, they will strike them, and ceasefire be damned. But I think that all those things come together. The fact that Hezbollah is fighting back is a surprise in and of itself. So what you're seeing now is a number of solutions. You mentioned the fiber optic issue, right? That obviously counteracts the electronic warfare thing. And these quadcopters, they're battery operated, so they don't really have much of a heat signature. So a lot of the measures to find these things don't really work. There's some acoustic measures that you could find them, but then there's the question about what about shooting them down. So Israel has a number of options that it's deployed and is also developing. But I don't know if you're an American football fan or Canadian football, but there's a saying that if a team says, "Oh, we have two great quarterbacks," it means you don't have any quarterbacks, because if you had one quarterback that was good enough, you wouldn't need two of them. So the fact that they're putting forward all of these solutions mean they still don't have the solution. One of them they're thinking about is mass developing one-way suicide drones that can be used for offense, to attack a target, but also to detonate alongside the incoming drones. To have that happen, you need to find them, and you need to be able to close with them. So that's one solution. Of course, there's all sorts of passive measures, like using netting, making sure when you park armored vehicles and tanks, that they're really close up to buildings, under trees, things like that. So that is certainly helpful. This morning, I was hearing about a technology that was inspired by what's going on in Ukraine, some sort of something that looks like barbed wire that can be used around bases, and when it detects an incoming drone, it can start spinning in the air and try to cut the cable. Now, that is another indication of an Israeli failure, because the person who introduced that was the one officer who was his job was to liaise with the Ukrainian military, and he's the one who identified that as a possible solution. Only when he moved into the ground forces unit that is coming up with new technologies and new tactics is he able to advance this. So it seems like he was ignored for a while as well. But the bottom line there is there's a lot of things being done. Oh, by the way, there's also these kind of shotguns that have been ordered, or ammunition that can be fired from the rifles that the soldiers have, that splits up. And it's kind of like, if you're hunting small birds, that it spreads over an area, and that you just need one or two of them to hit, and it could actually destabilize or bring the thing down. So there's a lot being done right now. It's absolutely a focus, but I think there's no question. That's my bottom line, is that something was missed here. It should have been seen. There were people who were sounding the alarm. I quote some Israelis in my article that were active duty officers who were writing in IDF publications in Hebrew and warning about this. And we know that they weren't listened to.
You mentioned shotguns, and people think I'm joking when I say this, but I don't get to go much because I have kids and they take all my time. But in theory, I shoot skeet, the little clay pigeons that get shot out of a machine. And I've got a really nicely balanced double-barreled 12 gauge that probably gives me better anti-drone capabilities than most Western units, because you can actually use these things. And I know for a fact, having spoken with Canadian officers about this, that they actually did an inventory of every shotgun in the Canadian forces to try and figure out, where are these things? And it turns out a lot of them were being put in like military police units or on ships for naval boarding parties and things like that. But now we're thinking this could be an infantryman's last line of defense, or a tank commander's last line of defense, where if you hear the whirring noise, you grab the shotgun and you look around and you hope you can knock this thing down when it's still 30 or 40 feet away from you. And I think you made the point really well. Like, Israel is probably more than most Western militaries very agile. The IDF is quicker to bring in stuff, to adapt. I guess kind of just out of necessity, it has to be. But I've been looking at most of the NATO militaries, we've known drones were going to be a problem for 10 or 15 years, really should have figured it out after Armenia and Azerbaijan, and really didn't pay much attention to what was happening in Ukraine until very recently. Look at the Americans. You would have seen the same story. The Americans telling the Ukrainians, no, we don't need your help. And then thousands of Iranian drones are hitting all the Gulf Coast states. And all of a sudden the Americans are like, well, actually, maybe we do. I think it's encouraging to see Israel leaning into this, trying to adapt on the fly here. But I wouldn't want to be, well, I mean, for a lot of reasons, I wouldn't want to be IDF infantrymen in Lebanon. But right now, like you said, I think you had it so right. Death from above is not something they or most Western militaries have had to worry about for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about this, I think, mostly as a tactical discussion, but in terms of Israel's strategic problem here, the new approach, since this is kind of a bigger issue, but since Israel has won none of its post October 7th wars decisively, now the government is leaning into this idea of buffer zones. So in Gaza, Israel controls over half of Gaza. In Syria, there's buffer zones all along the border. Some of it is to protect the Druze, but obviously to protect the border. And that's what it seems like we're settling into in Lebanon. In order to do that, first of all, it's very manpower heavy, but you can't have soldiers dying regularly in those areas, or else there becomes an uproar. I'll remind you, I don't know if you were paying close attention in the 90s to this. I've discovered this through research, but what got the Israel out of southern Lebanon wasn't any great, move by Hezbollah or anything like that. It was Israeli civil society that started from 1997 when there was a helicopter crash, but started to make its voice known that it would not accept 20 to 30 IDF soldiers dying every year they couldn't understand why. They said, we can defend ourselves at the border. It's not like Hezbollah is crossing into Israel. If they try to, we're at the border. Let's pull back and let's stop losing to 20 to 30 of our sons every year. So this actually puts, if this continues, this actually puts the whole IDF approach to the Lebanon problem, which is quite a thorny problem, at some danger. And that's where the strategic element comes into play here.
I'll unmute myself. That helps. Well, I do remember a little bit of that, but I also remember you've mentioned this already. The 2006 war, when Hezbollah had taken some Israelis hostage, and Israel responded massively with sending a ground force into Lebanon, and then discovered that Hezbollah had, you mentioned the anti-tank missiles, like Hezbollah had developed technology and tactics that Israel had no response for. And we're not looking at exactly the same situation now, but I got to be honest with you, it has felt somewhat familiar to me, right? Once again, Israel has felt compelled to go into southern Lebanon, and is once again encountering Hezbollah capabilities that it's not ready for here. The one thing I will say, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it does seem like Israel is responding better this time. I think in 2006, they didn't know what to do. They didn't really have a plan to counter these anti-tank missiles that Hezbollah had. I don't know if they have a plan, but I think they're responding quicker now. Like you mentioned that officer who probably wasn't listened to on time, but now he's being listened to. Is the IDF, to your view, I mean, you've been talking to some of the personnel who are out there, are they responding fast enough? Like, are they actually engaged on this, or is there still the issues of kind of bureaucracy and denial?
I think no matter what, when you're dealing with the military, it's going to be less nimble than it could be if it was in the private sector. But as you're seeing that it's now moving as quickly as you would hope. You're seeing that, this morning there was a report that there is a new factory going to be built using ultra-Orthodox soldiers to put together up to thousands of drones a month that can be used for attack and for defense. And all sorts of, like I mentioned, all these ordering of solutions, ordering the actual equipment. It is certainly in the units in the field is something that they're talking about and that they're sharing lessons with all the time. And this is something that absolutely, and a lot of the solutions come from the ground up, right? In these things, that these are, whether they're reservists, and if you've been around any Israeli reserve units, you have people who are, PhDs, CEOs of companies who are there, just as warrant officers or something like that. So these are people who are empowered, and it's a very non-hierarchical army, so it does lend itself to solutions coming from the ground up. At the same time, you need to scale them, which takes some time. And there's an instinct in militaries, and you're seeing this in Ukraine as well, that when things are working, let's say unit per unit, and in Ukraine, they kind of have their own private sector companies that belong or that are connected to a brigade. The army gets nervous and they want to organize things and put rules and so it'll slow things down. And I'm sure that the IDF will do that as well to make sure. They did that with the observation and attack drones, right? So Israel came into the October 7th wars with very centralized drone units. It's not like every company had its own drones, infantry company, and people started, sitting around and building them or ordering them. And then the army liked the idea of them having drones, but it said, we need to know, which drones are coming in and all that, and they have to be approved, and we want them to be military grade. So that will probably happen to some extent, but there's a lot of pressure. And I think if you look at the coverage of it, it's not only my coverage, it's also in other Israeli publications that this was missed, and it's going to continue to be in the headlines as long as soldiers are being injured or, God forbid, killed by these drones. Those questions are going to continue to be asked. I'll just add another layer to this. We talked about tactical, we talked about the strategic. Let's talk about the politics of it. The government is going into elections at the latest in October. Going to be a difficult election for him, right? He was the prime minister who was in office on October 7th. He has made the case that, a number of ways he's tried to deflect this to the security services, but he's made the case, listen, there was a concept in the security services that I'm not responsible for. And good thing I'm here in office because I've been able to have this relationship with the U.S. president. I've been able to lead these successful wars in Gaza, Lebanon, a little bit in Syria, and of course in Iran. And therefore, no one else could have done this, and I'm the guy to lead it. This starts to become a less compelling argument when, like I said, these wars are kind of stalled by these Trump-imposed ceasefires. And if soldiers are, again, getting killed in Lebanon and Israel's not able to aggressively maneuver and deal with this Hezbollah problem because Netanyahu is not able to convince Trump to allow him to, I think that really undermines a lot of his campaign message. So that is also a part of it and might even add more urgency to the need for solutions.
Since October 7th, you and I have not had a lot of opportunity to talk about nice stuff. Like one day I'd like to talk to you about like barbecue or, our favorite sports.
Let's do it.
One of the things that worries me, and, obviously you in Israel, you're much closer literally to the front lines than I am here in Toronto, but drones are going to be the ultimate asymmetrical weapon, and they're going to be almost democratizing. And I'm using that term somewhat in cheek, but they're going to really level the playing field, right? Because terror groups that can somehow come up with a couple $1 million, they can have thousands of drones. These things don't cost much. And if you are a reasonably competent terror group or, rebellion or secessionist movement, like whatever, you get a donation of a few $1 million. You create some company in Delaware or something, right? Just a completely deniable company, and you order 1,000 drones from China, and a couple of weeks later they show up on a shipping container, and you put them in a warehouse, and you attach some really basic homemade plastic explosive to each of them, and you can destroy an air force with that. Look at what the Ukrainians did to the Russian bomber force. There are other things you could do with them. I don't even want to mention them on a podcast because I have nightmares about them. But if you're looking to cause chaos and you have the ability to put a couple of hundred or maybe 1,000 explosive charges with high accuracy right where you want them to go, you can cause a lot of damage. And Israel normally, because of its security environment, kind of in the same way that I think Taiwan does or Ukraine now, Israel has normally been very much on the forefront of understanding threats and on the forefront of responding to threats. Israel has had great drone capabilities in an offensive and an intelligence gathering role for years.
Yep.
I'm genuinely curious how quickly Israel is going to be able to stand up actual meaningful anti-drone defenses that can cover the entire country. Because you and I, we've been talking now for 20 minutes. We've been talking about the Israeli forces that are operating in southern Lebanon. How long until someone tries to flood Tel Aviv with a few hundred drones in the middle of the afternoon?
Well, and it could have been tried already. It becomes more difficult because you can't do that with the fiber optics. Of course, there's a little caveat here that if, let's say, Palestinians get a state, that includes almost all the West Bank, then they would be in range with the fiber optics. So that's just another thing to consider when talking about that discussion. But in general, that would mean that every city would have to have, electronic warfare capabilities and maybe even these anti-suicide drones. It's absolutely going to become a bigger part of what defense planners have to think about. I will say if you're rooting for Israel, then you can look at other complex problems that the world didn't have answers for. Let's say the short-range rocket threat, the Katyushas, the Qassams, and Israel obviously came up with the Iron Dome, the ballistic missile threat with the arrows, and the anti-tank missile threat, where they came up with the trophy system. Israel's able to come up with these things, again, very advanced. It has the labs, it has the military thinkers, it has the private sector. It's able to do these things, but of course, there are soldiers on the battlefield who are facing these threats every day, and every day that goes by without a threat that was without a response that is effective and has been distributed to the forces, and the forces are trained on it, they remain at risk.
We only got a couple of minutes left, but I want to actually lean on your diplomatic correspondent duties just for a minute, because you've been covering Israel's relations with the rest of the world. And I think we can oversimplify things a little bit by saying they're complicated, particularly since October 7th. I've been looking recently at an exchange of pretty hostile public messages between Israeli and Ukrainian officials. The matter was regarding grain exports from parts of Ukraine that are occupied by Russia. We don't need to get into the details, but it just struck me as interesting that right now, if there are two countries in the world that have mutually shared interests in the field of coming up rapidly with anti-drone defenses, Ukraine and Israel probably should be pretty near the top of that list. The list is getting a little longer these days because of the number of countries that are under attack from drones. But in general, Ukraine and Israel should be probably getting along and working together on this. It ain't happening here. And I'm just kind of curious, you mentioned the private sector, even if the relations between Kiev and Netanyahu aren't warm, is the private sector able to work on this? Like, can Israeli private sector companies talk to Ukraine about, hey, how are you guys dealing with these Shahed drones or these first-person suicide drones or even the surveillance drones? Israel can build them. I know that, but the Ukrainians probably have a 5 or 10 year head start in just thinking about how to use these things in terms of the doctrine and the tactics of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. Throughout the war, the Ukrainians have been the ones who are trying to get Israel to be more on their side, to give them especially defensive technology, and have been upset about it. Israel has said, different reasons. Obviously, the main one is why antagonize a superpower, Russia, with which Israel has a deep and pretty respectful relationship, even though Russia funds their enemies. But the bilateral relationship is fairly good. At the same time, Iran says Iran is the enemy of both of us. They're the ones who have been arming Russia and teaching them how to build these drones. And of course, Iran is the big enemy of Israel. I think there would have been a lot of advantages for Israel to lean more into their support for Iran, especially, as you mentioned, Israel's struggles with legitimacy in Europe and other parts of the Western world, for whom Ukraine is a central issue. That continues in the personal relationship between Zelensky and Netanyahu, who haven't spoken since January 2025, somewhat oddly. Other senior Ukrainian officials come through and they say very positive things and they see the relationship getting better. But then, like you said, there was this weird thing 2 weeks ago about stolen Russian grain, and then it became a Twitter fight. And that's exactly when this first-person view drone problem really erupted. And that's obviously when the two sides shouldn't be fighting about grain. They should be working together for solutions. I hope that both sides understand that this is in everyone's interest, and it's perfectly logical that the private sector from the two countries leads this, obviously with the support of the two governments. Before the Russian invasion, you had tens of thousands, I forget how many, but tens of thousands of Ukrainian high-tech workers working for Israeli companies. It was just very common because they're cheaper than Israelis, but they're very good. This is something that should happen. And hopefully, even if the governments aren't going to be too quick about this, then the private sectors recognize the potential and the need, and they work through these things themselves.
You know, war is never nice, to state the obvious, but I was struck a couple of weeks ago about reading an interview with a Ukrainian industrialist who basically said, we're getting the cost of every dead Russian down to about $1,000. That's the cost of our defense, where it costs $1,000 to kill a Russian, and it's overwhelmingly done with drones. And I just thought to myself, if it's $1,000 today, it'll be $500 in a year, and it'll be $100 5 years after that. Like, this is the direction we're on, and I don't think anyone, excuse me, I don't think anyone has an answer for it yet. So, Lazar, like I said, one day we'll be able to talk about nice things, but for now, thank you for this. And look, I'll stay in touch with you on this. I'm actually fascinated to see how quickly Israel can respond to this. But in the meantime, keep up the great work. And you were very kind a minute ago. You said a lot of your colleagues are covering this in Israel as well. Maybe they are, but I like your coverage.
No, I appreciate that. I like my coverage as well.
Take care, man. Thanks for coming on.
All right, thank you, man. Yeah, see you. Bye.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by AC/DC. Canada's defense industrial base is fragmented. Critical platforms are owned and controlled abroad. That model doesn't work anymore. The Alliance of Canadian Defense Companies is rebuilding Canada's sovereign defense industrial base. AC/DC champions Canadian-owned, Canadian-controlled companies that design, build, sustain, and export next-generation defense systems. Change requires new processes, new policies, and new behavior. AC/DC membership is open to Canadian-controlled defense companies ready to lead that change. To join, email info@alliancecanada.com. All right, guys, that's it for me. Another episode of On the Line in the books. Many thanks to my guest, Philippe Lagassé from Carleton, a defense analyst, and Lazar Berman from the Times of Israel. Check us out, as always, at www.readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe. Check us out there. We'll get back to the Alberta stuff soon. Don't worry about it. But for now, we got a whole world to take a look at. We'll talk with you soon, guys. Have a great week.